Our first module discussed climate and changing weather patterns. Our second module discussed organizational endeavors to meet current needs. Now I'll ask risk management, emergency management, and an insurance company representative to discuss how each sector manages the exposure of changing climate conditions. Let me introduce James Kirby, Risk Manager for the Southern Nevada Water Authority, Rebecca Franco, Manager of Emergency Management for Denver Water, and Paul Fuller, CEO of Allied Public Risk. Paul, has climate change impacted the insurance company?
Leo, it has. The impact has grown more pronounced in recent years. The insurance company has evolved their thinking on climate change. It began with the belief, correctly so, that gradual climate phenomena had an impact on the frequency and severity of natural disasters. That belief was then predicated into models that ultimately were built to predict the impact of climate change on loss of property resulting from extreme weather events. That was our focus. It subsequently changed based on an epiphany that we realized climate change goes beyond just loss of property. It impacts the entire underwriting portfolio of our industry. A couple of examples. 2014, there was a devastating flood in Thailand, loss of life and definitely loss of property. But there was also billions of dollars of business interruption claims filed by multinational companies because the global supply chains were disrupted. Another example would be billions of dollars of crop damage resulting from excessive heat as well as prolonged drought. That has a direct impact on the agricultural industry. We also see life and health, ironically, also being impacted by climate change. Worsening mortality tables are being impacted, and that correlates to a degree to climate change. We can look at air quality, insect-borne, food-borne, and airborne diseases. But the real black swan is liability. And when I say liability, it's the litigation filed against policyholders, ironically not for the event of climate, but instead for failing to plan, failing to prepare. We're also seeing shareholder derivative suits being filed for the failure to mitigate climate risk, as well as the failure to disclose the significance of climate risk. So as if that wasn't bad enough, we have our holy grail, the investment portfolio, which is our compact of solvency to our policyholders, also impacted by climate change. And with all those factors, it makes sense that the insurance industry would move from being a laggard to a thought leader when it comes to climate change. And there's a tremendous amount of time and resources being invested identifying specifically the human, the financial, as well as the societal cost of climate change. It's a big deal.
Hey, Paul, do you think brokers and insurers understand this shift and how that's going to impact their premiums going forward into the future?
James, yes and no. I think it's certainly on everyone's radar, but not to the effect that I anticipated happening. Now, certainly, we're going to see a shift or a tightening in property rates, as well as a shift or tightening of property terms, mostly in coastal regions, as well as in regions that are deemed high wildfire areas. However, there's a surplus in capacity, particularly because of alternative capital sources. So that will be a change that is manageable, not disruptive. But the key issue, in my opinion, will be, and a game-changing issue, will be a total and absolute climate change exclusion on core liability policies, which I would define as general liability, professional liability, and directors and officers liability. So to your point, James, what I see is the removal of that coverage and the replacement with a specialty coverage form specifically for climate risk, very similar to what cyber liability and network security has done, where those exposures were removed from the core forms and offered on a standalone basis. Two reasons. One, insurance industry is very poor when it comes to anticipating losses on emerging issues. And climate change affects not just loss of property, but systemically it impacts the underwriting portfolio as a whole. And two, there's really uncertainty as to what coverage applies in a general liability policy, a professional liability policy, and a directors and officers liability policy when it comes to climate risk. Having it as a monoline separate policy gives clarity of coverage and also the confidence that a policyholder will actually have protection when there is a lawsuit filed against them.
James, as a risk manager, how do you address the risk of climate change to your organization?
I tell you, climate change is a very interesting phenomenon. I've been in risk management over 20 some odd years, and I've never thought of climate change as a risk prior to working with SNWA. It makes you think about it in a whole different perspective. Before, I would say risk managers just dealt with the effects of climate change. They dealt with the perils, flood, fire, windstorm, things of those natures, and then you just use insurance mechanisms to insure those. One thing good about working with SNWA is they've given me an understanding of what the impact of climate change can be. So what we've done is we've taken more of a holistic approach. We've started an enterprise risk management endeavor at our organization where we're interviewing all of the managers throughout the organization to understand risk that impact them. And one of those risks is climate change. So by doing these interviews from a risk management perspective, we can get a better understanding of what are some impacts that we need to deal with in the future. Can we just mitigate them, or do we need to transfer those risks to someone like Paul at an insurance company to insure for us?
James, one thing that we see on our side of the fence, the investment portfolio is heavily loaded in municipal bonds. Your entity is a bond issuer. You also have an obligation to continue your business operations and address climate change, particularly with infrastructure upgrades. There is a concern in the insurance industry that will stress a municipality's ability to both address the infrastructure needs as well as their debt service obligations. Do you anticipate that being an issue, and is it part of the stress test that you're undergoing in your enterprise risk management functions?
I would say definitely. One of the key things that impacts us is the cost of capital. And as previously discussed, risk management typically didn't look at the financial risk quadrant, but now we are. We need to make sure that we understand our bond covenants, what impacts our bond ratings, because like you say, that is key to us being able to operate very cost effectively and efficiently. So we're definitely going to have to start addressing that from a risk management perspective.
Becky, how are utilities working with their local emergency management programs?
For our utilities, we're an integrated part of our local planning committee, and so we're part of the Urban Area Security Initiative grant in the North Central region. So that's a 10-county municipality that we plan, train, and exercise for various emergencies. So we have a regional-wide HIRA-THIRA that is coming up where emergency managers are all a part of that, and the utilities are included this year, and we're trying to build capabilities that will address the various hazards that could impact our community.
Becky, how is your entity interacting both on the state and federal level when it comes to climate change? Is there a collaborative effort, a plan to address the needs of the citizens in your area? Is there a priority or a focus on human life versus property loss? Where is the resources and the time being expended?
Well, under the federal guidelines that we follow are under FEMA and EPA, and everything that we do is all based upon that all hazards approach. And so we need to have a better understanding of the science of climate change and overlay the research and figure out, are our assessments accurate? How accurate, and how can we pull in the data from our climate scientists and figure out, are we hitting the mark? So right now, we're really not putting a lot of emphasis on the climate change, but we're looking at all hazards approach.
Okay.
James, what challenges have you faced trying to address this issue?
I think the biggest issue is understanding the science and making sure you understand the risk that you're dealing with. Once you capture that, the second and probably the biggest impediment is silos. Organization silos, busting through those, wondering how to help people without people thinking you're trying to take over or interfere in their department. So I would say the biggest challenge is to let organizations and departments know that you're working with them, not against them, and that you're a partner in trying to resolve the issue. I think that's the biggest challenge.
And James, what type of role do you see, and maybe more bluntly, what role do you expect from senior management and the board of directors when it comes to supporting resources that need to be expended for climate change? But also, what is the best way to communicate the future needs, the future issues of climate change, the impact of climate change to ratepayers?
I would say from a senior management perspective, that's just key to get their buy-in and their support. It has to come from the top down. If you don't have the senior management buy-in, then you're not going to be able to bust through the silos. You can't bust through the silos from the bottom up. I've tried that before in other organizations and it doesn't work. So you definitely have to get senior management support. And that's what we did at Southern Nevada Water Authority is we went to senior management with the ERM program and got their blessing and explained the benefits and how we're not trying to take over the world, but how we're trying to, resolve the risk for the entire organization. And the analogy we use is that the organization is a house. Everyone has a room in our house, and we won't care what's going on in your room until it might interfere with burning down the entire house. So that's how we kind of look at it from that perspective is we need to do things and manage things that could impact the whole house, not just individual rooms.
And you're a well-resourced authority. Are there monies, grants available on a state revolving loan basis or through the federal government, maybe DHS, maybe USDA, that smaller or medium-sized authorities that don't have your financial prowess to take advantage of so they can also plan effectively for climate change and its impacts? I
would think there are. I'm not sure exactly what entities would have those resources, but I think there are some. And it might be the same resources that you would reach out to, Becky, and emergency management.
Correct. So through our planning process, under our mitigation, there is pre and post mitigation funding available, but it's really important that the utilities are involved with their local emergency management agencies, and they're part of those FEMA 5-year all hazard planning sessions where they can start identifying mitigation projects that they could submit for. They're based upon a competitive level, and it allows the utilities to try to capitalize on some of the federal funding that is available.
Right. How are utilities utilizing the emergency management planning process for planning resources, recovery, and mitigation efforts?
So emergency management for our agency, we really have to pull in the key stakeholders and really find out and understand what they're all working on. And how do we create that environment where everybody has a say at our table, they understand what we're doing. And we work on emergency response plans, and so we're taking all of the data and trying to figure out how does the organization build capabilities and capacity in order to respond to any kind of impact that hits our utility. And so we're going through that. So we have the planning process, and then we have the response capabilities, and then we jump into recovery. And so that's dealing with all of the damage assessment, how are costs being tracked, personnel, how are we using that, what efforts need to what contracts do we have to have in place in order to rebound from any kind of emergency that hits us? And then from there we go into the mitigation, is looking at lessons learned, how do we improve as a utility to try to lessen those impacts that hit our utility again.
Are regulators and rate agencies including climate risk in their solvency tests, stress tests?
They are. It's now accepted practice that climate change can be an existential threat to the insurance industry for two reasons. One, you've got the investment portfolio, which is that solvency bedrock of all insurance companies. Climate change, climate risk has a direct impact on the value, on the credit rating, as well as the liquidity of these investments. You also have potential impacts with carbon reducing legislation that may be imposed. You've got the issues with municipal bonds that we touched on before. Insurance companies are a big buyer of bonds, and if municipalities are being accelerating their infrastructure investments based on climate change, that can impact the ability to repay debt obligations. The underwriting portfolio is also in play. It goes way beyond just property loss and includes other lines of coverage. That's problematic for two reasons. One, it's not just contained with one line of coverage, and two, the insurance industry has had a poor track record of properly anticipating losses from an emerging issue, climate change being so systematic that it absolutely has a negative impact on rating agencies' scores as well as their assessment of an insurance company's ability to properly fund for that exposure, which is why more capital, more surplus is being allocated for premium writings that an insurance company is authorized to bear risk on. And then finally, there's a definite emphasis on enterprise risk management, on the stress test of solvency going back to climate change to make sure that insurance companies are properly positioned to handle this risk, that they have the capital funding to properly honor the compact that they have with their policyholders.
So Paul, do you see where some policyholders may need to be fearful if they're in an area susceptible to high climate change, maybe coastal areas where carriers may pull out and there'll be no capacity for them for certain sorts of risk?
Long term, yes. If we see a systemic issue of back-to-back and to back natural disasters of significance, but at the moment there's a substantial amount of property capacity, largely because of the alternative capital. The fact is, capital is looking for a rate of return that is beyond zero. And right now, insurance is one of those investments that you can maximize your rate of return. And unless there's an interest rate spike where you can get an alternative rate of return that's of significance, I don't anticipate there being disruption in the marketplace, but absolutely there will be pain for those policyholders that are in coastal regions as well as regions that have a propensity for wildfire.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the discussion on climate and risk. If you'd like to learn more, please go to AAWD&M website for other resources.